Hi everyone, welcome back to Cardvoyant. I'm Kris and I'm your Cardvoyant, and today we're continuing to talk about the Suit of Swords. So right away, let's get started with this Seven of Swords card. Now this card is, like all swords cards, multifaceted. It's very interesting. It can be quite positive, but it does have those negative connotations as well, as all the swords cards do. As you can see in this card, you've got this figure who is sort of absconding with his swords. He's got 5 swords in his hands, and he's leaving what some people have described as like an army encampment, like he's stealing the swords away from his soldiers, presumably. But I've heard other people describe it as almost like a circus tent or a circus atmosphere, which would sort of makes sense given that this is often about a card about deceit, about trickery, that sort of feeling of flim-flam, and that that has that sort of circus feel to it. But it is, in general, you can just see this, and you can see his face, and you can see that this card naturally lends itself to this idea of trickery. The thing that, as a tarot reader, that is up to you to determine is exactly how that plays out and exactly what trickery means in this sense. Because it can often have to do with you or your client's situation, people around you that are maybe not completely honest, are actively trying to deceive you in some way, or some situation in which there is some type of actual deceit or some attempt to hide some information from you. So there's that idea, the people that surround you, but there's also this idea of perhaps it's you. Are you or your client trying to skirt the issues, some responsibility? Are you actually trying to deceive people? Are you trying to get away with something? And this card speaks to all those things. As you can see, the thing about this card is that the figure in the card, the guy who's running away with the swords, is actually holding the swords by the blades. And that's very important in this context because there is a definite message here that when you play with swords, you can get cut. And it's kind of that idea of no matter how artfully he is in his deception, that he's handling these swords that can be very tricky, and there's a very, very good chance that he's going to end up the one who's wounded. Of course, the other part of this card, the other idea with this card, as we've talked about in some of the other sword cards, is that it can also be something internal. Are you hiding something from yourself? Are you trying to deceive yourself just about the way you're going about life, about things that have happened in your past, about the way that you're conducting yourself or your business to make it feel to yourself like it's okay? What are you justifying? What are you trying to rationalize? It's calling on you to be the most honest version of yourself that you can possibly be. And the reason is the same. I mean, because if you actively engage in deceit, even it's of yourself, there's going to come a point when you are the one who is injured, or you may end up injuring others as well. So the thing about the Seven of Swords is it's quite easy to see what it's about. And what's up to you and your intuition is to determine the ways in which this deceit or this wrongdoing or this attempt to cover up is playing out, and who it's playing out for. Is it people around your client? Is it your client themselves? Is it internal? Is it external? One of the things that's positive about this card is that even though the figure is, running away with these swords that he's so happy about stealing, there remain 2 swords behind him that are firmly planted in the ground. And this is this idea of a permanent truth. So even though someone may be trying to deceive you, or, it can be, think of a workplace situation where you've got a coworker who is not completely honest and somehow it's affecting you. Or think of yourself when you're trying to deceive yourself, or maybe it is you who's trying to sort of put something over on someone. Um, the idea is that this truth will without, right? I mean, there's always a strength in truth, and chances are that at some point and in some way or another, that truth is going to come out. Now, that can be something that might be, threatening to someone who is asking for a reading and knows that they are engaging in this kind of behavior, the trickery kind of behavior. But it ultimately is a message of hope and, instructional too. If somebody's sort of playing fast and loose with the rules, it can be instructional that the truth is what it is. And almost always, in one way or another, and at one time or another, will come out. Now, the part of this Seven of Swords that isn't quite as dire or quite as, deceitful is this idea of strategy, because this can be an idea of strategy, of somehow working things to your benefit in a way that might circumvent red tape or circumvent certain people that are going to try and put the kibosh on it. I mean, it can be this idea of getting around things that may be technically deceitful, but is ultimately for a greater good, or for something with good intention. Now, again, it does tell you that you can run the risk of getting caught, and there's no guarantee that that's going to be a positive thing if you're caught. But it doesn't always speak to something clearly like bad or evil or, deceitful in a negative way. It can be something that is more strategic. But in general, when you look at this card, you can see that there's that element of some sort of deceit or trickery. Now, one of the good things about this card that I love, and you know how I feel about yellow in cards, is that there's so much yellow in this card. And I have a feeling that is about this light of truth, this idea that there is a light to truth that ultimately shines down and illuminates what is meant or needed to be illuminated. So in that sense, this can be a positive card, depending on what side of the trickery you are on. Now we come to the Eight of Swords, and this is a card that often people will get and be afraid of, or somehow immediately kind of identify with. And it's deceiving in that it looks very ominous. But as you can see, the figure in this card is bound and also blindfolded and has these swords all about her. So it's this idea of feeling trapped, feeling victimized, feeling as though there's no place to turn. But there are important things to notice about this card. First of all, apparently she's been captured in some way, but there are no captors around. There is nobody guarding these swords. There's no other figures in this card. Secondly, the swords don't completely surround her. They're on the sides of her and somewhat behind her, but they're not in front of her. She could certainly get out of the swords that are near her. And then also she has the binding that's around her loosely, but her feet are not bound, right? She can move. She's standing in this water that also speaks to, intuition and those kinds of things. But she certainly could move from this circumstance. And then also she's blindfolded. In both cases, with the binding that's around her chest and also with the blindfold, they're rather loose. You get the feeling that she could almost wiggle out of them, free herself if she chose to. So this is another card that speaks so much to situations and also inner dilemmas. Because what this is talking about is the ways in which we limit ourselves, the ways in which we allow circumstances, our past, other people to define us and to define our lives, and thereby limit ourselves. If you remember in the Two of Swords with the figure with the crossed swords, and we talked about the options that those swords represented, in this card, this Eight of Swords, you almost have the feeling that it's not about options, because she doesn't feel that there are options. That's why there's the binding. That's why there's the blindfold. That's why there's these swords feel so ominous, because the figure is truly feeling constricted, bound, cut off, captured in a way. But again, look at all the imagery in the card. None of this is true. So it asks us to examine the ways in which we bind ourselves, what we don't know, what we refuse to see, that keep us firmly planted in somewhere that we probably don't, obviously don't want to be, that leaves us feeling as if we have nowhere to turn. So this card brings all these things to light. And if you're reading for someone, they may have a feeling what this is about. You may have a feeling, depending on the other cards as well, and your own intuition, what this is talking about, a particular circumstance or the past or a person. Now, often this can be about some authority figure. It could be some authority figure in your life, some other type of authority figure, or even institution that acts as an authority. Often about your past. It can be about, growing up, your parents or other authority figures. And that's symbolized by the background. You can see the castle in the background. That's this authority that sort of looms over her shoulder. So what this card is talking about is acknowledging that although you may feel bound, although you may feel restricted, although you may feel victimized, there are ways out. Now, some of the other cards in the reading that you give may speak to this, may talk about the ways that can help you find your way out. But sometimes it's just a matter of acknowledging it. Often it's a matter of seeking help of some kind and trying to figure out the best way to find that help, or the ways in which help can be given to you or brought to you. This often speaks about our beliefs, our belief system, or our specific beliefs that are only beliefs. They're not truth, right? And that's so often the case when we talk about things we believe. They aren't necessarily the truth. They're the things that we do believe or have come to believe in our life or have been taught to believe. And so this card also calls on you to think about your beliefs and think deeply about them, and where do they lead you? If you believe that the world is a negative place, or that everybody that you meet at work is negative, you're pretty much guaranteed to meet negative people. Like attracts like. So this speaks to that also. It speaks to the ways in which we define our world that we are not seeing clearly. And that's what's happening in this card. She's not seeing the world for what it is. She's not seeing that there is a way out. She's not seeing that she can walk away. She's not seeing that there's no captors about her that are keeping her there. She's not understanding that she can loose the things that bind her. She can take off the blindfold. She can use those swords that are planted in the ground to guide her because of the things she's learned from them. And that's another thing the swords can represent, are these things, these pillars in our lives, whether they're truth or not, but that can ultimately guide you to find your own truth. So this card is very much, it's very personal. There's so many of the other sword cards that speak to external circumstances and then also have an element of what's going on internally. This is like mostly internal and then also external. But so often in life, the things that we think bind us are actually things that we have constructed ourselves, or that we have not acknowledged, or that we fear, or that we have not applied the full measure of ourselves to disassemble. You know, the imagery that you see is pretty much what you get with sword cards. Now, this card is another card of anxiety, pain, guilt, worry, fear, all those things that some of the other sword cards have also addressed in various ways. As you can see, the figure in this card is sitting up in bed, her head in her hands. There's just like anguish. You can feel this. You can feel the guilt. You can feel the worry or the fear or the anguish. And on her wall, she's got these 9 swords stacked up. And these represent our worries, our fears, our thoughts, our guilt. People sometimes in our lives stack up and accumulate and weigh on us. I mean, these are hanging on the wall almost like a ladder of fear or a ladder of guilt or a ladder of pain. And this is what's keeping her up at night. It's about this sort of hamster wheel that goes on in your head sometime when you think about things in your past or things that are going on or things that are bothering you, or sometimes about anger, things that you can't let go of. But the whole idea is that these are the things that keep you up at night, literally. And sometimes you'll see this card in a reading for yourself, but especially for other people, and you will say, what's going on? Something's keeping you up at night, obviously. I mean, this card couldn't be more literal in that sense. But there's also a message of hope in here. So even as we have this time, maybe we're going through something, or your client's going through something, or maybe it is an accumulation of things that tend to play out over and over again in your mind, especially at night. For some reason, we feel especially vulnerable to these things, prone to this kind of repetitive thinking, this cumulative thinking at night, right? It's when our head starts to clear and we allow things to creep into our mind that maybe during the day we're busy and we can't really think about. But at night, you start to calm down, and then you relive these things, or you start thinking these things, or you're counting out the wrongs that have been done to you, or the worries that you have. And you get this feeling of loss and of pain, of anguish, and so you'll see that, in the reading. You'll instinctively know that. Obviously, I mean, this card is so clear when you get it. The thing, we've talked about hope that are in other sword cards, and this is here too, because how we had in stained glass window, we've had stained glass windows in several other cards, and they are always this light of hope. They often have this feeling of spirituality and of comfort. Well, in this card, you get a literal comforter on the bed, and it's covered with these roses, which is an idea of purity and of passion and of hope. Roses always sort of symbolize an eternal or continuous or continuum of hope. Also on the bed are these outlines of like astrological signs, and this too is this idea of sort of the eternal nature of just the universe. This idea that all of this there's a sense to it. Things will make sense eventually, and so it is a message of hope, and it's a message of knowing that even though you may be in this sort of dark place or a dark time or literally darkness of night, that the dawn does come. That until you can get there is comfort to be found, whether that's in friends or family or meditation or professional help. And they can help you get through this darkness of night and come out better for it in the light of day. So, speaking of cards that can be quite literal, you get this Ten of Swords. And this is another card that looks very intimidating, frightening, very bleak. And it is a card often about endings. It's about things sometimes that have ended badly. It can be literally that feeling of having been stabbed in the back by someone, somebody who you trusted sometimes. There are other cards, especially sword cards, that sort of speak to that kind of, we've talked about them here, that speak to that as well. So this often is more about endings, that feeling of defeat. Sometimes, just like the card itself, if you look at this very dramatic pose here with all these swords in the back of this poor victim, it can be a card that's about a perceived death, or it can be that feeling of being victimized. And sometimes it can be about sort of over dramatizing a situation. And so again, the questions that your client are asking, the other cards that are in the reading, your own intuition will speak to exactly what this card is saying to your client. It'll define what this card is saying, because it isn't necessarily as bleak or as dark or as deathly as it seems. It is about learning the hard way sometimes. I mean, sometimes to get into this Ten of Swords position, that idea of hitting rock bottom, sometimes that is the only way that we learn. Sometimes, especially in relation to people, sometimes it takes a lot for us to understand the true nature of a person. We've all heard the saying, when somebody shows you their true colors, believe them. But for a lot of us, it takes more than once to believe them. We're apt to give people the benefit of the doubt. And sometimes this card can represent getting to that point where it's just so obvious that you can't go on with this person or this relationship or this situation. This is about something that has come to an end or needs to come to an end, that you've finally realized. But again, it's not all doom and gloom, even though it seems really bad. It's not, though, because think of it this way. Think of it as I said, people having to reach rock bottom before they can lift themselves up. The figure in this card has finally become grounded, literally laying on the ground, where they are having to feel the full force of the earth and understand the truth of that. So the truth of a situation, the truth of a person, the truth of your past, or the ways in which you've dealt with the past, right? So you're coming to terms, you're smack dab on the earth where you have to come to terms with this. Notice also that the figure is facing the water. And again, water almost always represents that intuitive sense of ourselves, that eternal nature, that soul part of ourselves. And in this case, you can see the water is calm. This isn't like a roaring tide. This isn't turbulent water. This is calm. And that's the peace that you sometimes get with endings. And if there isn't a peace in the ending itself, there's a peace in finally knowing the truth. There's some sort of calmness to that kind of end that brings you to the truth. And this is what this speaks about, bringing you to the truth, bringing you to a place from which you can rise. And that rising part is symbolized by, again, the yellow in the background. Yes, there are these dark clouds over the figure now, but you can see that beyond the water, going through the intuitive soul part of yourselves to reach the other side, there is this light, there is this warmth. So even though this card can seem obviously and clearly very difficult, and can be thought of immediately as negative, there are things in our lives that test us, that teach us, that bring us to a better place. And this card though it recognizes that you are going through something, have gone through something, maybe are beginning to get an inkling that you're going to have to go through, even though that has happened, is happening, is on the cusp of happening, there are reasons for it, and it can certainly bring you to a better, calmer, lighter, more beautiful shore. Well, there you have it, everyone. We're done with the numbered cards for the Suit of Swords. Next, we will do the court cards, and then we'll be completely done with the Suit of Swords, and we will move on to the very lovely Suit of Cups. Until then, please subscribe and ring the bell if you'd like notifications, and thank you so much for tuning in. See you next time. Bye.